I believe that everybody has a story, and I'm fascinated to hear them. So come with me as we take a walk down Fascination Street. Welcome back, Streetwalkers. This episode is with Joe Lafferty. Joe wrote a book called Just in Time, a memoir of faith and the fight for life. And this is a compelling story. This is part one. In this episode, we get to know Joe and all of the crazy cool things he's gotten to do in his life. From surviving cancer before he was even a teenager, to becoming a traveling spokesperson for the Leukemia Society, making friends and hanging out with everybody from Dan Marino to Rob Gronkowski. We tell those stories and more and get to know each other a little better. Like I said, this is part one, so make sure you come back next week for part two. And this is part one of my conversation with Joe Lafferty.
Yeah, talk to me, yeah.
Welcome to Fascination Street Podcast, Joe Lafferty. How you doing today, Joe?
I'm wonderful, Steve. I'm so pumped to be here. Love the show. Love the Streetwalkers. Can't wait to get into it.
Fantastic. We have been, I guess, sort of communicating back and forth over social media for, it's got to be close to a year now. And finally, we're able to make this work. So thank you, quarantine. Now, Joe, since you are a listener, you know that I do like to start with a nice, easy softball to sort of get us rolling. Where were you born and raised, Joe? Where'd you grow up?
I was born and raised in Titletown, home of the world champion Pittsburgh Steelers. I was born in the fall of 1972, and the only significant about that was I have a sister that's just 14 months older than I am. So my mom had two quick ones, and there's only two of us. I was born in September. The first time my mother left us home alone with our father, she went to a Steeler playoff game with my Uncle Lenny, and she did not witness it because everyone's taller than her, but the immaculate reception happened at that playoff game.
No kidding.
No kidding. And in all the sports people I've met and interacted with in my entire life, I've never had the opportunity to meet Franco and tell him that story.
Franco Harris. You know, I know that you're not an autograph guy, but I actually do have Franco Harris's autograph on the wall right there. I'm pointing at it right there.
He's a great guy. His story at Pittsburgh is a great one, too.
Yeah, I bet. Oh, by the way, you did mention that you had a sister. I do know that she loves to hear this, so this one's for you, Tara. Good afternoon, Joe. How's your sister doing today?
She loves the fact that in many circles for many years, she was Joe's sister and not Tara, but then she rose to prominence in our area, serving on a school board, so I quickly became Tara's brother. She thought she had it bad until she came to this event at a school, and I introduced her to this young lady, and I said, "Oh, this is Grace." And she said, "Oh, well, actually, I'm Ryan Mundy's sister." And Ryan Mundy was a Pittsburgh Steeler. I coached him in high school. And it was funny because my sister thought she had it bad. I'm a nobody, let alone being the sister of an NFL star.
Yeah, that's like, what is Tom Brady's little brother's name? Nobody knows. I don't even know if he has one.
Exactly.
See? So I understand. So when you were a little tyke in the late 70s, early 80s, you were a swimmer, right?
I was. Back in the day, get up before school and put in a mile, 72 laps. This is back when youth sports were very structured and they didn't take everyone. And in the wintertime, there were open meets and there were invitationals. Invitationals, you had to have certain times in qualifying events and qualifying meets to be invited. So there was a handful of us from the team that went to invitationals. And at one point when I was 9, I did have a national ranking. So that was before sports and youth sports became like a business. And it was a very competitive, and I loved every minute of it. But then the day I found football, I stopped swimming.
Wow. Why? What was it about football that made you fall in love with it so much?
I've analyzed this over the years, and I think every once in a while the coach would bring a radio out on the deck and play music during practices, and I loved that. Had they had waterproof earphones, I would have swam my entire life. I thought it was the monotony of the practices and staring at the bottom of the pool for hours on end. Football was a love. It was a first time, the first day I was able to put on a helmet and run into other people and get knocked down by other people and get back up. It appealed to I think my sense, I had beat cancer at that point. I was diagnosed with cancer when I was 8 years old. I didn't start playing football until I was almost 11. So it was on the back end of my chemotherapy that I started playing football, and I don't know what it was. It was love at first sight, really, with me in football. Love at first hit.
Really? Well, I am born and raised in San Antonio, Texas, and I know that you love to say that Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh and all that is football town or whatever, but come on, bro. Texas football, come on.
Well, I'll play Cliff Clavin for you Cheers fans for a moment. It's an interesting fact that the book, Friday Night Lights, the author whose name escapes me, he was going to write that book about two places. One was Odessa, and the other place was Aliquippa, Pennsylvania. It was the exit of the local industry where both towns collapsed around the high school football team. And it was oil in Odessa, and it was steel in Aliquippa. And I don't know why he didn't pick Aliquippa, because Mike Ditka had already come through there, and Tony Dorsett was from the next high school over, and Joe Namath was right down the street. Some people had already come through that area. I don't know why he didn't pick Aliquippa, but he picked Odessa and Permian, which that's a legendary book. I think he picked the right one. I just don't know why he picked it. But yeah, football in Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania, in Texas. Texas is like, the biggest brother. But I think Pennsylvania holds its own. I know my own high school did pretty well, and the high schools around us did really well. So within a concentrated area, maybe we could compare, but to compare a whole state, because the football and the professional football players that have come out of Pennsylvania, well, almost all of them come out of the west end of the state, not so much the east end where Kobe Bryant and a couple basketball guys came out of.
Right. A quick story, about 15 years ago, my stepson was moving to San Antonio from Mississippi, where he grew up. He was, early 20s at that time. And when he got to San Antonio, our other kids were, I think, in middle school, and we lived real close to the high school. And we went for a walk, and he saw the school football field, and he was like, "What is this, man? I thought that that high school football in Texas was supposed to be something, man. Our high school football field was way bigger than this, and it was this tiny little town in Mississippi." And I said, "Well, you just wait till game night." And so game night, we drove over to the real stadium, not the practice field. The way it works here in San Antonio is there's 4 or 5 stadiums, and there's, it's probably 30 high schools here or something like that. And he was just like, "Oh my gosh, they don't even have their own field that they play on for games." And I said, "Well, let's go check this out." So we go, and he freaked out because, yes, every school doesn't play at their own house. They play in a stadium or whatever, but it seats 50,000 people.
I did my time in Texas working for the Cowboys, and we'll get into that. But I know those stadiums more in Fort Worth than over in Dallas. And since in Dallas, some high schools have built their own fields, but those shared fields where they have games Thursday, Friday, and Saturday night, maybe a matinee game on Saturday, and they just rotate them through, and it seats, like you said, 30 to 50,000. And they rotate them in and out because they can't have that many stadiums that seat that many people at every single high school. So the quarterback clubs in those Texas high schools always amaze me, and their tailgating, and they have a ball. They're much more organized.
I just want to tell that quick story because people who aren't from Texas, when they do come here and they see the little rinky-dink practice field at the local high school, all y'all pay attention. Just know that that's only where they practice. And maybe the freshmen played there, but that's about it.
Well, I have a question about San Antonio to you.
Okay, hit me.
When your stepson moved to San Antonio, did he want to go whitewater rafting at the Riverwalk?
Let's hope not. You ever been to the Riverwalk?
Well, since I was born in the city with literally 3 rivers, when I heard of the Riverwalk, I lived in Dallas and I was going to San Antonio for Thanksgiving. And I thought, the Riverwalk goes through downtown. It's the neatest thing. And when I saw it, I said, "Where is it? Where's the river?" And they're like, "That's it right there." And I just said, okay. It wasn't what I thought it was. It was very underwhelming.
It's not what anybody thinks it is. And famously, Mark Cuban hates the San Antonio Riverwalk. He is very passionate about his hate for the Riverwalk. For those listening who haven't been here, once a year they drain that area of the river and clean it because that's, downtown with all the tourists and stuff. And when they drain it and you look over there, you look way over into that cavernous abyss, and you say to yourself, that's knee deep at best. So what they did was they rerouted part of the river to go through San Antonio downtown. But yeah, it's only about knee deep at the deepest downtown. Now, the San Antonio River is deeper elsewhere, but that particular part of it that is, I guess, famous is about knee deep.
I didn't know that about Mark. When I met him, I should have brought up that topic.
Oh, he's passionate. He would have talked your ear off.
He's another guy from Pittsburgh.
Oh, I had no idea. I honestly had no idea he was from Pittsburgh.
He went to the same high school as Joe Manganiello, the actor.
I love Joe. That's the dude married to Sofia Vergara, right?
Yes, sir.
Cool. But let's not talk about all those fools. We're here to talk about you fool. Oh, in all of our interactions that we've had over the past almost year or whatever, I never told you this. When my mom was 15 or so, she was diagnosed with, I don't remember if it was non-Hodgkin's or if it was Hodgkin's. Either way, she was diagnosed with lymphoma at about age 15. This would have been probably 5 years before you were born. So my grandparents took my mother to MD Anderson in Houston, and they were trying out some new therapies. There was a few people that were her age, her symptoms, and so they did two separate treatments, and they were guinea pigs for these two different treatments. My mom it was an experimental cobalt treatment. I don't really know what that entails or anything about it other than that, and that they don't do it anymore because it's so dangerous and deadly or whatever. But that saved my mom. Whatever that cobalt treatment is or was, it got rid of it, and my mom got to live a happy life. And that was it when she was about 15. It was only 2-3 years later that she had my sister, and then another year and a half later had me. So I'm really happy that they were able to knock that out. The other test group that did not have the cobalt treatment, whatever they did to them, none of that group survived. So I was very grateful for that. Then fast forward to 2013 when my mom is 58 years old, and she is diagnosed with leukemia. The doctor announced, after chemo or whatever, the doctor announced that the chemo was working and things were looking good. And then 12 hours later, all of her organs started failing and she passed away. The reason that I bring up those two different things is because part of that mirrors your story. So when you were a child, was it non-Hodgkin's?
Yes. When I was very young and I was part of Indian Guides, it's the Boy Scouts with your dad. You go to Indian Guides, fathers and sons, and you learn the ways that the Native Americans honored the land. We would camp and we learned about conservation. We'd go on whitewater rafting trips. It was an amazing time. And it was on one of those trips, my father walking with his hand on the back of my neck. He noticed it was swollen and I was snoring. I was snoring so loud, I had to sleep in a tent by myself instead of my friends because I would keep them up. Went home, went to my local family doctor. He treated me for swollen glands 1 week. It didn't go down. Same thing another week. And went to the hospital for a biopsy, and it was non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. They gave me a 70% chance of survival and a protocol to go through that would take 2 to 2.5 years, depending on my reaction to the chemo and the radiation. And I went through that, and in the midst of that was swimming and playing baseball and tennis on a tennis team at my local community pool. So it was, swim practice in the morning, tennis practice in the afternoon, and meets in the evening for both. So I was a pretty active kid, and my dad kind of set the tone the day he told me that I had the cancer. It was my mom and my sister and myself, and it was actually my sister's birthday when they had to tell me. I was an active kid. My dad just reverse psychologied me and said, well, you can lay around for the next 2 years and not go to the pool and not play tennis or play basketball with your friends, or when you're sick, you can lay on the couch. But when you're not sick, go back and do what you want to do. Which, to an active 8-year-old kid, I'll take the second option. But he set me up for the rest of my life. And I equate this to the ethnic background of my mother and my father. My mom's 100% Italian, and she's a fighter, so she taught me how to fight. And my dad's a stoic Irish guy. And what he taught me is don't give up any ground. So you can only fight for so long, but don't give up any ground. Don't go backwards. You fight as much as you can, and then you stop and you rest and you wait for your next opportunity to move forward or to fight. So with that advice of my father and that track he put me on, he set me for the rest of my life. And when I turned 13, I became an insulin-dependent diabetic because my pancreas stopped working. My pancreas had gotten beaten up pretty bad during the chemo and radiation. I still played high school and college football as an insulin-dependent diabetic. Went to a small Division II school on Lake Erie, Mercyhurst College, home of the mighty Lakers. After that, I worked for 3 Division I athletic programs, the Orange Bowl, the Dallas Cowboys.
Hey, Streetwalkers, here's a word from our sponsors.
Guess what, Streetwalkers? The gear is here. A bunch of you have been asking for quite some time, and now finally it's here. Head over to FascinationStreetPod.com and check out the Gear tab. There, you'll find all kinds of FSP items to tickle your fancy. T-shirts, coffee mugs, sticker packs, pins, buttons, coasters, and my personal favorite, for just $5 you can get one of those weird little phone handle pop thingies. So head to FascinationStreetPod.com and show the world that you're proud to be a streetwalker. Special thanks to my good buddy Stephen O'Reilly from the Bar Star Podcast for these dope drum beats. Check out Steve's work at O'Reilly Drums on Instagram or search Stephen O'Reilly on YouTube.
Let's get back into it.
So you played football and it took you to all these different places and the Miami Hurricanes Stadium. What's it called? The Orange Bowl, you said, right?
Well, yeah, and if I could rewind just a bit, I also wanted to give back. So that little bit was kind of what I did, but I immediately started giving back, which I didn't know that's what I was doing. I thought I was just helping people. You know, when I was 12 years old, I got a phone call from my pediatric oncologist, and they wanted me to go meet with the executive director of the local Leukemia Society chapter, which that's what it was called back then, the Pittsburgh Leukemia Society. And we went down there, and they had a little spread of drinks and cheeses. And my mom took me down there, and I met the people who worked there, and they were all very excited to meet me. And I went and sat in the conference room with the executive director, and George was his name, and he started asking me questions. Like, why are you thankful? Tell me why you're thankful. What I didn't know what had happened was George had this great idea, which was they wanted to try a different tack with their fundraising. Instead of showing the sickly kids with the bad wigs and the hat on to cover the bald head, which I never had a wig, but I definitely wore hats to cover my bald chemo head, he wanted to put someone out there who had already been through it and was thankful. And if it was a boy, that was good because they had a lot of sport-related activities. And they supposedly called my pediatric oncologist and said, hey, well, this is what we're looking for. Do you have a kid that can talk? And my savior at the time, Dr. Michael Wollman, Long Island, New Yorker, said, you want a kid that can talk? I have one that doesn't shut up. So they sent me down there, and I got to meet them, and I immediately started getting up in front of dozens and hundreds of people at events, thanking them for their donations to the Leukemia Society of Pittsburgh. And I became a ball boy for the Pitt Panthers and started meeting what would be some of the best college football players in the history of college football and some of the best professional football players as I continued my work with the Leukemia Society. And that's how I met Dan Marino and some of the other greatest football players ever as a teenager.
So at the time that I think you said you were 12 when you first went to the Leukemia Society, right? 12?
Yes, sir.
By then you were, do we say remission or do we say cured? What do we say?
You say remission. You're immediately in remission, but they normally have like a 5-year date when you get out of it.
Gotcha. So cancer-free is remission until it's been 5 years, and then you can just say free or whatever?
Sure.
Okay. Sure.
Yes.
So you're 12 and you're in remission, and you get this call, and like you wanted to give back. So I'm assuming that you were not paid for these guest speaking appearances, right?
No.
And so you did it solely because you wanted to give back.
Yes. My parents always taught me to be thankful and to help others. And my mother was a teacher. My father was an officer in a union. And I saw in their jobs and what they did where they helped people. And we are always told to be polite and kind and help people. I thought that's just what you do. And I never really thought about it. I admit the first couple times you start to say something in front of people with a microphone in your hand when you're 12, 13 years old. But George and I had developed what I'd call a stump speech, and I had talking points. And one of my lines was, because of people 25 years ago giving money to research like this, I'm alive today, and I thank you. And, with lines like that coming from a 12, 13-year-old kid, to people who have just played it in a golf outing, or they had auctions and different things and dinners. That's what they want to hear. They want to hear about a success story. They had these courage awards, and I would go there and accept the courage award. And I was just always very thankful. It became a lot more fun being the kid in the room with a bunch of adults. And then when those adults are local celebrities that are on the news and local football heroes and then national football heroes, it gets to be a little intoxicating.
Yeah, I bet it does. So at the beginning, you were really just doing it out of the kindness of your heart because, you know, your parents taught you that that's kind of how you are, is to be gracious. But then it developed into you were also getting something out of it. It just wasn't money, right? I mean, it was sort of a win-win. You're helping people and also you're getting to experience these interesting moments, right?
One of the amazing events I did every year was the Dan Marino Leukemia Open. And that's when all the players would come in and they'd be there for 4 or 5 days. And I'd be hanging out with these NFL guys for 4 or 5 days. But, you know, throughout the year, there were a lot of go sit in a mall and hand out information on a table about the Leukemia Society. There are a lot of those events too. So, you know, while one of those events is like the Super Bowl, there's a lot of other events throughout the year where, you know, you're doing a fundraiser at a high school and they have a jump rope marathon. And I would go there and there'd be a bunch of kids. Or I remember a middle school did a jump rope marathon and I had to go speak to, I don't know, about 50 or 60 fifth graders who were doing a jump marathon to raise, at the time, $200. These weren't thousands of dollars. So yeah, the bigger events definitely had the coolness factor, but there were a lot of little events throughout the years that I love to do too. You reap what you sow. It definitely got to be fun, and I definitely got something out of giving back, but I'd say that I kind of lived this Forrest Gump-like life. I have had so many once-in-a-lifetime moments and once-in-a-lifetime medical challenges, so I'll take them because it's made me who I am, and even the challenges that have come in my life have been blessings.
It's funny that you mentioned Forrest Gump. I have here on my notes, after I read your book, it seems like your life is like the non-mentally challenged version of Forrest Gump. Well, real quick, I just want to go back to something you said about your parents. You said that they raised you to be kind and reciprocate kindness and that kind of thing, and to be gracious. I think that used to be a common parental guidance, and I don't feel like, I could be wrong, maybe it's just some of the people that I'm seeing, but I feel like some of that might have gone out the window. I'm seeing a lot more teaching in the realm of get them before they get you. Get over on them before they get over on you. And so I just wanted to, shout out to your parents. That's really good parenting. And there should have been and should still be more parenting like that.
I agree with you 100%. And of course, at the time, you think your parents are mean. And my wife and I have a friend, and they have a 6-month-old baby, Oliver, and I almost cry every time I see a picture of the kid. He's so cute. They're from out of town, and they have a family out of town, but they're here kind of alone. And Megan teaches with Jennifer, and we've become close with that couple. And I told them, I'm like, I know I'm not going to be this kid's godfather, but I do want to be the one. I want to be the threat. I want Megan and Nick to say, listen, if you keep acting up like this, Oliver, we're going to send you to live with your Uncle Joe. Because that's what my cousins were told growing up, because my dad ran a tight house. And my dad is fun and funny. And, when you're doing the right things, he's lighthearted and will fool around and has 1,000,001 bad jokes like old men do. But it was the structure. And there's a story in my book. I was going through chemo, and it was a family event, and I was screwing up. And my dad yelled at me. And one of his friends said, how can you be hard on that kid? He has cancer. And my dad turned to him and said, you know what happens if I'm easy on him now and let him get away with things now, when he beats cancer, and that was my father speaking positively into the situation, when he beats cancer, I'm going to be left with a brat that doesn't know how to act. So the point I wanted to make that you just said about parents and kids, when I got in trouble at school, my parents' first reaction would have been, what did you do? Not what did the teacher do to you? My dad's mentality was, you think you got in trouble in school, wait till you get home. They may put you in detention in school. I'm going to ground you for a month at home. That was the kind of mentality back then, and that was my parents. And some of my friends didn't have as strict a dad, but I think in the long run it served me well and kept me structured and definitely kept me alive.
Well, again, kudos. And I'm glad that you have noticed some of those things as well. That makes me feel not so crazy. Now, Joe, I am going to jump around a little bit. I want to jump back to when you were going through chemo at an early age. I believe, and this is super cute, I believe that sort of your reward for the lack of a better term, stomaching chemo, was Doritos and a Coke, and that it was sort of a comfort food for you after your chemo appointments. Is that still a comfort food for you?
No, and a Hostess apple pie. You forgot about that.
Oh, my gosh.
So I grew up, my mom's 100% Italian. She's an amazing cook. I learned that over the years, too. My closest friends and my mom, they could all cook. Because when I got out into the world and started going over to other people's houses, and this is in college and when I became a young adult, not everyone's mom is a good cook. I'll leave that out there. But my mom was a good cook, so we ate good food, but we didn't always have a lot of junk food around. We had Italian bread around all the time, but to have those Doritos or an Hostess apple pie, that was a treat. That was a reward for getting through the chemo. And I think it was only one time that I convinced my mom I felt better and was no longer nauseous. And I drank some Coke and ate a couple Doritos and then threw them up, which, it was always like, wait, I'm fine. Let me get the treat. I think it was just one time where I got the treat and then got sick again. So she was leery after that, but that was the treat. No, that's not my comfort food. When I became a diabetic, I stopped drinking soda with sugar.
Yeah, I bet.
Well, no, I'm no longer a diabetic, and I could drink sodas with sugar when I do, but no, I never went back to drinking soda with sugar in it, and apple pie every once in a while, and not really a Dorito fan. I think in college I used to every once in a while get Cool Ranch Doritos when I had an apartment. But back then, yeah, that was my comfort food for sure.
That is so cute. Now, Joe, we keep talking about the book, but I don't think I've even said what it's called yet. Ladies and gentlemen, streetwalkers, if you will, the name of the book is Just in Time. Justin as in a name. Just in Time, a memoir of faith and the fight for life. Now, Joe, you had a co-writer, and his name is Jeff Schober. Why does that name sound familiar to me?
Jeff Schober is a renaissance man for right now. He was a single guy who was a sports writer and a high school teacher. So he was single into his 40s. He had a full-time job as a high school English teacher, and he also wrote and traveled sometimes with the Buffalo Bills and the Buffalo Sabres. And the funny thing about Jeff, which never ceases to amaze me, is his love of 80s hair band music. He still plays hockey at 51 years old, ice and street hockey. As cool as that sounds, I'll call him and he'll say, hey, I went and saw Sheena Easton last week. I don't know where he has this geezertourdate.com, but it's always amazing. And he just knows so much about music. He, like me, found the love of his life in his 40s and married Terry, and they have 2 little boys, just like my Jennifer has 2 boys. And he wrote the book Growing Up Gronk. When Gordy Sr., the dad, Papa Gronk, Papa G, as he's known to many, when he wanted to write a book, he needed someone to help him write it. And essentially, Jeff interviewed Gordy and turned it into a book. And my process, I called Gordy and said, hey, Jeff Schober, this is a great guy. And he said, well, yeah, here's his number. Tell him I sent you. And I called Jeff a couple years back, and he had just finished another book. And I had to pitch him my story. And I said, I'd already written 27,000 words, and I don't think I have anything. But I gave him some of the highlights and the people I knew. And he said, give me your 27,000 words and give me a timeline of your life and some of those names, and I'll look at it. And I said, okay. So I sent it to him, and he called back a couple of days later and said, listen, I'm driving from Buffalo to North Carolina to visit my dad. Would you want to meet? We'll sit at a Starbucks and talk for maybe an hour. I'll just pull over and, and we'll talk. I said, absolutely. So I met Jeff, and we talked for 3.5 hours, and it felt like 5 minutes, and we just instantly got along. And he left there saying, you know what? He recorded our conversation as well. And he said, I think I'm going to do this book, but I'm going to go visit my dad for a couple of weeks before I go back and start school. This is my time away from my wife and my stepsons. I go down and stay with my dad. This is our kind of guys' time. So I'm going to go do that for 2 weeks, and then I'm going to drive back, and I'll let you know if I want to do this book. Well, 2 days later, the phone rings, and it's Jeff, and I was very shocked to see his number. And he said, Joe, we're going to do this book. And I said, oh, great, Jeff, but I thought I wasn't going to hear from you for like 2 weeks. He said, my dad made me call you because I won't shut up about you and the story. So shout out to Tom Schober, Jeff's dad, for just saying, I'm tired of hearing about this kid. Don't leave him hanging. telling me you were going to write the book. Tom was the first guy to read the book and loved it, and obviously a big fan of his son's work. But yeah, so shout out to Tom for getting the book done sooner than later. So Jeff and I worked for a year, and I gave my 27,000 words, and he would interview me, and he'd put it together a chapter at a time. And one of the genius ideas that he had was, and I'm putting this in my version, not the way he put it, because mine's a lot more to the point and direct. Jeff essentially said to me, since you're no one, why don't we talk to some of your friends who are famous and see if they'll contribute to the book? And we'll put a magazine-style article every couple chapters to have people talking about who you are. And we'll include your mom and your dad and your sister and your, at that time she wasn't my wife, and Justin's parents, and maybe some of your friends. And then we'll go for your famous friends too. And we'll see how many of these interludes, these other voices they're called, we can get to make the book more marketable. And one thing that Justin's mother said, her quote was, you pick up the book for Rob Gronkowski and Dan Marino, but you keep reading it for Joe Lafferty. And that was the highest praise from the one person in this world who I know is my hero, Rhonda Bussard. So I met Jeff and we worked hard. He's not my co-author. He's my bro-author. I'm really proud of what we did. And we are 50-50 partners in the co-author process because there's no book without me and there's no book without Jeff. And I know this is naive. I don't think anyone else could have got out of me what he got out of me. I once needed some counseling, and my friend is a psychologist, and he said, yeah, you need to go talk to someone that's not me, one of your best friends. And he actually drove me there, and I said, well, what do I say? And he said, Joe, he's a psychologist. You go in there and you dump out the garbage, and he sifts through it to what's important. And I see Jeff did the same thing. Like, I dumped information out of my mind, and he sifted through. There's a lot of other stories that didn't make the book, believe it or not, but he sifted through and I think found the best. And I know he made me look good, and I really appreciate it.
Well, shout out Jeff. Thank you, Jeff. And thank you, Tom.
Hey, Streetwalkers, here's a word from our sponsors.
Hey, guys, if you like what I'm doing, click the Amazon banner at the top of the homepage on FascinationStreetPod.com and do all of your shopping through Amazon. Once you click on it and it takes you to Amazon, you can bookmark it or add it to your favorites, and you won't have to go to my site each time. It helps them keep the show going, and again, thanks for listening.
Hey, hello. Are you interested in getting from A to B while sitting? At Detroit Bikes, we've got a new product that I think you're going to love. It's a bicycle. It's got 2 wheels, hence the bi. And the sickle is because it's a cycle that your wheel's going. So this is a product where you've got a seat. You are actually sitting while moving.
Wow.
And it's as easy as just pedaling, pushing with your legs. So we think that customers are going to love this product, and we hope you'll check it out at www.detroitbikes.com.
www.detroitbikes.com.
Let's get back into it.
Again, I did say we're going to bounce around a little bit. You did mention Justin's mother, and we're going to hold off on explaining who Justin is for just a little bit longer. So back to the Leukemia Society and your speaking engagements with them and all the work you did with them. That's how you met Dan Marino, right?
Exactly. When I first got teamed up with Leukemia Society, Foge Fazio, the late, great Foge Fazio, or his real name is Serafino Fazio, he was the head coach of the Pitt Panthers and a legendary college, and then he was an assistant coach in the NFL. He did very well. Briefly, he was the head coach of the Pitt Panthers, his alma mater. His famed recruit was he got Tony Dorsett to come to Pitt, and he was the head coach for a couple of years, and it was his golf outing, his Leukemia Open, where I won my first Courage Award and started to meet Chris Dolman and Bill Fralick and some of these guys that were affiliated with Pitt, Mark May, Russ Grimm. Those are 2 of the former Pitt Panthers that were also members of the famed Redskins offensive line, the Hogs. These were guys who would come back and play in this golf outing. And then after Foge left Pittsburgh, they got Danny, as he's known in people in Pittsburgh, Danny Marino, to be the honorary chairman of the golf outing. And he started bringing in NFL guys. And the beautiful thing at that time, this is the late 80s, every quarterback had a golf outing in their respective cities. So you got those guys to play in yours, then you played in theirs. So they spent their spring and summer golfing in the nicest courses in the town. So Danny had quarterbacks come in, Steve Young, Vinny Testaverde, Bernie Kosar, Jim Kelly, Jay Schrader, Joe Namath. So these guys came in, and then other guys like Mario Lemieux and Bill Fralick again, and several people, these NFL titans would come in, and you got to hang around with them and get to know them real well over a couple of days and watch them play golf and have fun. It was an amazing time. And being that I'd win an award, I'd kind of get to be in the VIP room and talk to these guys. And I was the only teenager there. And they'd ask me about my own football career, which wasn't much, but it was fun to kind of feel like those guys were my older brothers. So after being around them for 3 or 4 days, they get to know you and, hey, Joey, come here and tell this guy your story. And it was a lot of fun. It taught me how to be around people that were famous, which is, don't ask them for things. Don't ask for autographs. I watched those guys be in intimate moments and someone would come and ask for an autograph, and they were always gracious, but you could tell it ruined the flow of a conversation sometimes. So myself, I'm not an autograph seeker, although there are some autographs I would like, but I'd probably have to go out and buy them. I'd be too leery of asking, unless I have gone to things that were specific. I got a Bill Mazeroski autograph because he was signing baseballs at the Monroeville Mall. So I will wait in line to get an autograph if that's what they're doing. That's okay in my opinion, but to bother someone while they're having dinner to autograph something, that's just not me.
Well, that makes sense. And so are you still friends with Danny today?
Friends, that's a funny term. We know each other.
Are you friendly?
I saw him at the Super Bowl. I went down to Miami to represent the National Kidney Foundation and walked Radio Row for 3 days and did as many interviews as I could talk my way into and podcasts. And he came the one day, and he's had this same agent. Shout out to Ralph Stringer. He helped me coordinate with Danny so Jeff could interview him for the book. Danny's been with the same agent dating back to his early days in Miami. Ralph used to be around for the golf outings, Ralph Stringer. He's a legendary agent and great guy. So I went over and saw Ralph. Danny was on with Mike and Trey Wingo and said hello and met the CEO of Isotoners. Danny's still with Isotoners. Danny came off, got to talk to him for about 4 or 5 minutes because when those guys are doing Radio Row, they're being paid to go from show to show to show. And I've heard this. This wasn't from Danny. This was from another celebrity I ended up talking to. When you're getting paid 6 figures to give radio interviews all day, that's all you do. So he was going from show to show, and hey, it was in his backyard. It looked like he was having a blast, but I did get to talk to him for about 4 or 5 minutes and wished him well, and he was working. So, how long can you talk? You go visit your friend at the pizza shop, which one of my best friends owns a pizza shop and runs a pizza shop. So I go to work and I might only talk to Joe or Rob for 5 minutes, but that's because they're working. So Danny was working. So I got 5 minutes worth of time, and I was very thankful to get that.
Very cool. In your book, in the parts where you talk about Dan Marino, you mention a serving leader and that he showed you what that was. Can you tell me what that is?
Absolutely. So the term serving leader comes from my life and author mentor, John Stallworth, who wrote a book called The Serving Leader. And I didn't know it at the time, but that's what Danny is. Anyway, when we showed up the first year that it was Danny's golf outing, there's a big cocktail party the night before, and it's at the Pittsburgh Field Club, which is in Fox Chapel, which is the old money section of Pittsburgh. And the Pittsburgh Field Club is one of the most beautiful private country clubs in Pittsburgh, beautiful views. And they have this old bar, this kind of big oak bar in the front. And we went in there, and it was my mom, dad, and sister. The funny thing was my dad and Dan Sr. were in the same union. Dan's dad was a truck driver and my dad was a route man. Both worked for the Post-Gazette, and they were in Teamsters 211. And they knew each other as Joe and Dan. Of course, he knew my dad was Joe Lafferty, but he didn't know he had a son. And my dad, who I love the man, he's a genius. He leads the league in common sense, but he probably doesn't know whether a football is stuffed or blown up. He did not know that was Dan Marino.
Sorry.
My dad knew that Dan Marino's dad was in the union. We're talking about over 500 guys. And my dad knew Dan, but he didn't know they were the same person. So when they walked in, they looked at each other and went, Dan, Joe. And, this is Mr. Marino, Dad. I'd already met him. And he's like, oh, Mike. So they had something to talk about, which was work. And my mom sat down with Cindy and Dan's mother, and Dan started serving drink. Mrs. Lafferty, can I get you a drink? And he started walking back and forth to the bar, getting his mother and his wife and my mother and my sister had a soft drink, getting them drinks. But he was the waiter, and he was just he was serving them. He was serving his mom and his wife, and then he served my mom and my sister. And I thought, that's the best quarterback in the NFL, taking care of his mom and his wife. I want to be that guy. I didn't want to be the best quarterback in the NFL, but I think I knew that was a long shot. I knew I wanted to be like Danny and serve the people in your life. And he served me plenty of times, giving me opportunities to talk and to be around people. And I thank him for it. It definitely changed me.
Is that the biggest lesson or biggest thing that you learned from Dan Marino in your time with him? What I learned from him, and I see a lot of in the famous people that I know personally, and maybe I'm just attracting those kinds of people like Rob Gronkowski, all the Gronkowski brothers and Papa Gronkowski, Bucky Dent, Art Keogh, the NFL guys that I knew since they grew up, Jerome Bettis I've met and talked to on several occasions, Jason Garrett, who I had a run-in with kind of when I worked in Dallas. They are kind all the time. They don't fake it, and they serve the people around them. They're so gracious, and they're so kind. When you're around someone long enough, you get to feel what they're really like. Because someone who doesn't really like to be around people, doesn't like to serve people, they start to get anxious. And those guys that I mentioned to you, they don't get anxious because they're very happy being around people, and they know that they're a celebrity, and these people enjoy them being around. So it's not a matter of I'm doing this because I have to. It's that I know I'm a celebrity. This is my responsibility to make people feel better, and I'm going to do it. So they serve. And, people can say, yeah, if I was that famous or if I was the best tight end in the NFL, I'd sign every autograph. Well, that's just not true. It's not easy being famous. It's not like digging ditches hard, but it's not easy doing that and giving up a lot of your free time. So I think I've attracted some people in my life. I've been around a lot of good people, and I never mentioned those who I've interacted with that weren't good people. But the ones that I've been around, man, they're awesome, and thus far awesome guys that I've always learned a lot from, and they're just great to be around because they're so good. Well, that is good to hear. Jason Garrett, I don't know if you know this, you probably do since you are an encyclopedia of football knowledge. Jason Garrett used to be the quarterback of the San Antonio Riders in the World Football League.
Absolutely.
And for some reason, because I'm a silly, silly person, I still have his football card, like his card when he was a quarterback for the Riders. World League football, get out of here. So, eventually, you ended up going to Memphis. Why?
From my book, Captain Anthony Scarpino, now the United States Navy, was a high school friend. We were rivals. We were quarterbacks for adjacent high schools, but we were not rivals in the fact that I'm 5'10", and he's 6'4", and he has a rocket for an arm, and I have a wet noodle. But we would go to these camps around Pittsburgh, and I tried hard, but I never took it seriously, like you said when we were talking before. Once you beat cancer, doing well in football is important, but it's not the end of the world when you don't. So I had a different outlook on life. When you beat cancer as a kid, I was never afraid to cross a room and ask a girl to dance. I knew getting a no wasn't the end of the world. It would stink and I would be embarrassed, but I wasn't afraid to try. So when I would end up at these football camps with quarterbacks from all over the city, Tony was the best. And I just didn't take it seriously as they did. I tried my best. I tried hard. But sometimes the high school guys get competitive to a point where it's not fun. And Tony didn't have to compete hard because he was the best. So we got this kinship going, and then track season came around, and he threw javelin, and I threw javelin. And in the book, I tell a story about almost killing one of the best football players in America with a javelin, accidentally. And that's when Tony and I started talking more, and we became friends. And by the time he was in college and I was in college, even later in high school, we would hang out together. When we were in college, we stayed in contact, and he said, come to Memphis for the summer. I can get you an internship since you want to work in sports. And I said, no, you can't. Within a week, a guy called me from Memphis and said, hey, if you're here for the summer, I'll put you to work and give you the experience. So I got in the car and followed Tony to Memphis and started working for John Bowers and Bill Lanston at the University of Memphis just 6 days after they changed the name of the school from Memphis State to the University of Memphis.
Now, during that time, I believe there was at least one run-in where I think you got to shoot some baskets with one Anthony Hardaway, better known as Penny Hardaway. Is that true?
Well, in Memphis, it's pronounced Peeny, but yeah. Penny we're the same age. He had just left and had his rookie season with the Magic. He was the toast of the town.
He was the toast of the country.
Obviously, but in your own hometown, he was the legend. And everyone was excited and talking about how he'd be around in the summertime. And there were a couple times that he was in the building and ran around and talked to people. And I was just out of the building at that time. So I was walking across campus and I saw this maroon-colored Lexus trimmed in gold. And I saw on the front the Orlando Magic license plate. And I was like, okay, that has to be his. So I go over to the small gym on campus and I open the door. And who's shooting baskets but Tinny? I just walked in there. I'm like, hey, I introduced myself, said I work for the athletic department. I've heard a lot about you. It's really neat to meet you. I said, hey, I'll rebound for you. And he, shot and made like 38 of 40 just around the key. And then he's like, all right, you take a couple. And I shot a couple. And, I was in very topsiders and khakis. It was about 10 minutes of just shooting around with Penny. And he asked me where I was from in Pittsburgh. And then the basketball team started coming in. And I said, hey, it was nice meeting you. And I left. And that was my run-in with Penny. A gracious guy. I didn't try to talk to him too much. We just shot around, and that was it.
Hey, Streetwalkers, here's a word from our sponsors.
So this person spent quite a bit of time in the commission of this monstrous act.
Hi, y'all. I'm Vincent, host of Gone Cold Podcast, Texas True Crime. Each week, we take a thorough look at lesser-known unsolved cases throughout the Lone Star State. Hear victims' stories as told by their loved ones, and expert insight from law enforcement and medical professionals.
Using a hatchet, that's an extremely violent and rageful type of act.
The truth is out there somewhere, and you can help us find it.
Before I die, I want to know who did it.
Please join us as we examine forgotten Texas cases. Subscribe and listen to Gone Cold Podcast, Texas True Crime, on your favorite podcatcher.
There are monsters among us.
Let's get back into it.
A note about Penny being gracious. One of his ex-bodyguards used to work with my wife. This is about 10, 12 years ago. And by this time, Mr. Hardaway was with the Miami Heat. He wasn't with them for very long, but at this time he was with the Miami Heat. And just out of the kindness of his heart, he told his, it was his buddy, it was his friend, his ex-bodyguard. He gave him a couple of tickets to the Spurs versus the Miami Heat and, sitting in the Miami players section. And that was for me and my wife and my kids. And so we got to go and enjoy that, which was cool. But then afterwards, he came over to us. I guess we were sitting in his seats or whatever. But he came over to us and talked to us and took pictures and chatted with us. And he is one of the nicest guys ever. And right behind me, I have a game-worn jersey from when Penny Hardaway was with the New York Knicks. And then over there on the wall, I have an autographed playoff-worn tennis shoe from when he was with Phoenix.
Wow.
He was super nice guy. But one of the coolest things about that shoe, besides, the autograph and how cool it is that I guess his insignia is a 1 cent. And so that's emblazoned or embossed onto his shoes. That's so cool.
Yeah, I remember those shoes. And it sounds, do you have anything else there in your Hall of Fame? Do you have the bat that Shoeless Joe Jackson gave to Babe Ruth? Do you have any of the memorabilia like that there? Sounds like quite the museum.
No, but I do have the first base that Babe Ruth stole.
Are you serious?
No, I'm messing with you.
Oh, okay.
The only other, I've got some Spurs stuff, signed things like that. And I've got Franco Harris, which I told you about, a few Avery Johnson things and whatnot. But recently, I guess the newest thing I got is
You got a signed copy of Just in Time, a memoir of faith in the fight for life, don't you?
It's not signed, but yes, I do have one. See, not only are you not an autograph seeker, apparently you're not an autograph giver, this dude.
I send people books, and they yell at me for not signing them. So I just need to, suck it up and not be embarrassed and sign them.
But the most recent thing I got was a Pete Rose autographed baseball.
Wow.
I know, he's got some stigma, but I couldn't pass that up.
No, that's very cool.
And you know, a thing about Pete Rose, when I saw him, he was signing autographs in a mall in Vegas, and apparently he does that all the time. But when I was talking to him, when he was, signing the ball and we were taking a picture, all he wanted to talk about was Kawhi Leonard, because that was right when Kawhi Leonard it was right before he left the Spurs. And so there was a lot of talk about whether he was going to be healthy enough to play or not. And that's all Pete wanted to talk about was Kawhi Leonard, which I thought was really cool.
I coached high school football with a guy who was an amazing athlete, and he was from our area around Pittsburgh, Wilkinsburg to be exact, and his name was Billy Morton. And he was an all-state football player and an amazing baseball player, drafted right out of high school by the Cincinnati Reds. And he was a catcher. So, in training camp, he was backing up. At the time, the Cincinnati Reds had a pretty good catcher. His name was Johnny Bench or something like that. And Billy bummed around the minor leagues with Pete Rose's little brother, I think the story goes. But the best part of this story that I'm telling on behalf of Billy Morton, who is a legendary assistant coach in Pennsylvania football history, but Billy was called up to the major leagues. This is the mid to late 60s. He gets called up to the major leagues to play. And his mother didn't have a phone because not everybody had a phone back then. So he called his neighbor back in Pittsburgh and said, "Hey, I'm calling back at 6 o'clock. Get my mom over there so I can talk to her." So come 6 o'clock, Billy called home and said, "Mom, you won't believe it. I'm getting called up to the major leagues." And she said, "Billy, there's a letter here from the Department of Defense and you need to come home." And he said, "Well, open the mail." And he did. And it was a draft notice. And he drove through the night and got back to Pittsburgh and was just back a couple of hours. And he drove his mother's car downtown Pittsburgh, I guess to see if he could get it extended or, not leave. But they left from there. His mother's car got towed. They left from there, took him to the airport and went to basic training. And he ended up in Vietnam.
Whoa.
Yeah. He did some very heroic things and decorated and went on to raise two great daughters who were both Division I basketball players and coached a lot of guys that went on to the NFL. He's, like I said, a legendary football coach, a great storyteller. That's one of his stories I just told. But that's my connection to Pete Rose. Billy used to run around with Pete Rose's brother.
That is crazy. Joe, are you an organ donor? Can you be an organ donor?
I can be. When I was 16 and got my driver's license and I got the chance to pick, I remember vividly thinking, well, I had cancer. I don't know what they'd want of mine, but if they want it, they can have it. And that's actually the way to think about it because no one knows how good or bad their organs are. It would take a doctor and with your medical history to be able to tell if you were viable to donate your organs, tissue, or cornea. And so it's different for everyone. If you were an active cancer patient, they wouldn't take your organs. People think like you don't want what I have, and that's not true at all. And the sad part about organ donation, if I could give some stats, is that 7,300 people a day die in the United States from various ways, but only 1% of them die in a manner that facilitates organ donation, and that's in a hospital on a ventilator. This is massive coronary, this is massive head trauma, where you end up being brain dead and there's no function in your brain. And they do a brain apnea test and they have to repeat it after a certain number of hours to verify that you have no electricity, no pulses going through your brain. No one has ever come back from that. That's not a coma. That's not anything else. Once you're brain dead, you are brain dead. And then and only then, while your heart's still pumping and you're on a ventilator, then and only then can you be an organ donor. So it's a very small number of people out there who can be organ donors. And last year, almost 40,000 organ transplants were done. And the number goes up about 3,000 every year. They almost broke 40,000 last year, but it's an amazing thing they do. And back when I was 16, maybe it was some foreshadowing, but I said, yeah, I want to be an organ donor if I can be.
Well, on my license, there is a little red heart. And it has been probably since I got my license at 17. I encourage everybody out there to be an organ donor because like Joe said, you don't know what they can use and what they can't. So you might as well just give them the whole thing and let them pick what they want. It's sort of how I feel about recycling. There's all these rules about what you can and can't recycle. And I'm just going to throw everything in there that I think you can use and you can throw away the rest.
Absolutely.
So you worked for the Dallas Cowboys, and you lived in Dallas before you went back to Woodland, right?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
Okay, let's talk about Dallas.
Well, when I finished up at Seton Hall, I had a bad taste in my mouth and wanted to get back to Florida. I missed it from my time at the Orange Bowl, and I had my heart broken. And I packed up my car and drove back to Florida and just thought I could get a job. Took a little longer. I made cheesesteaks at a Pittsburgh-based grill, but that was in Pompano Beach, Florida. Shout out to Craig Caffro, the owner. I was trying to get a job, and the Sports Business Daily, every week they would put out jobs, and I'd get the faxes at the restaurant. And I saw the Dallas Cowboy Radio Network in Dallas, Texas had a job for an account executive. So I applied and had a phone interview, and of course I knocked them dead. And I did well in the phone interview, and they, despite having no radio experience, they flew me out to Dallas for an interview. And I got up early and, got out of Fort Lauderdale Airport about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning and flew to Dallas and interviewed all day at the radio station. And the last interview I had of the day was with the sales manager. I'd met the station manager and the Cowboys sales manager and the programming director and a couple people on air, and they were just putting me off before I had to meet the guy who was going to ultimately make the decision. They sent me to lunch, came back, and I met with David Henry, and he was the sales manager, the big cheese. And I was tired, but I thought I gave it my all. Apparently I didn't. And I actually changed my flight. I didn't fly back to Fort Lauderdale. I flew back to Pittsburgh. And a couple days later, I got the phone call that I didn't get the job. And the reason Craig Zurich said I didn't get the job was, Joe, you just don't have any radio experience. And I said, oh, okay, well, thank you very much, Craig. And I hung up the phone. And I turned to my sister, who was a radio salesperson at the time. And I said, well, I didn't get the job because I didn't have any radio experience. And she very wisely said, Joe, they knew that when they flew you in there, it has to be something else. So she and I spitballed and had some ideas. And a couple hours later, I called back to Dallas and knew that it was this David Henry person I hadn't impressed. And I asked for him and said it was important. And he got on the phone and I said, David Henry, it's Joe Lafferty. I interviewed last week. And he said, yeah, Joe, didn't Craig get back to you already? I said, he did. He told me I didn't get the job, but I think you're the person I didn't impress. And I'm going to give you a second chance at hiring me.
How did he take that?
Well, like you just did. My sister and I worked out. I said, what if I give him a second chance at hiring me? Kiddingly. And she said, that's what you do. You say it just like that. My sister was sitting right there. She's smarter than I am, but I just present it better. But she said, I'm going to sit right here. And if you're going to drop that line, and if you speak, I'm going to punch you right in the face. And that makes her sound like a brute. And she's not, but she's tough with me. She said, he has to speak next or this is not going to work. And I said, okay. So she's, teaching the shark how to bite. And I said, I'll give you a second chance at hiring me. And I dropped it. And I covered my mouth and was staring at my sister. And there's about 20 seconds of dead air in a radio term. And David said, I'm listening.
Oh.
And then I went into this spiel and said I'd be Mitch McDeere from the firm and I'd be there early every day and you're going to have to kick me out at the end of the day and I'm coming in on weekends. If it takes me 24 hours a day to learn this radio game, I'm going to learn it and no one's going to outwork me. No one's going to out-hustle me, which is a term they use where I played high school football. No one outworks us. No one out-hustles us. And he said, Joe, I'd wait by the phone if I were you. Do we have your number? And I said, yes, sir, you do. Within an hour or two, Craig Zurich called me back and said, I don't know what you did, Joe, but I'd like to offer you the job. What I didn't know is David Henry, although a tuba player in the SMU band, was a huge fan of General Patton and military dramas and fancies himself a Patton-esque leader and is still in the radio game in Dallas, making a killing and doing a great job. But that was the right thing to say to him, to challenge him. That David fostered that in his salespeople, and I loved it. He offered me $500 if I ever got thrown out of a car dealership trying to get a sale, and I tried to make that happen. At the first Cowboy game, he said, come see me about tickets, and I got there late in the day, and I said, do you have a ticket for me? Because we had to be there. And he said, no, I'm out. And he said, you have the Dallas Cowboy logo on your business card. If you can't talk your way into the game with that, you can't sell here. Well, when he got to the luxury box, I was waiting for him. I didn't just talk my way into the game. I talked my way up to the Dallas Cowboy radio luxury box, which he then sent me to seats after that. But I talked my way in there too.
Well done.
So David Henry fostered my arrogance and my kind of no fear mentality. So that was a lot of fun working for him. It wasn't long enough. I didn't do a great job. It was a very hard sell, but I had some great times in the time I was there, and it's a fond memory of working in Dallas at that time.
Now, something else happened in Dallas, but before we get there, what did you do at the Orange Bowl?
I left the University of Pittsburgh because I wanted to get out of Pittsburgh. It's a great place, but I learned if you wanted to move up in sports business, you had to move on. I didn't want to sit around and get stale anywhere, kind of be what I would call a lifer. So I thought I had to move on to move up. With a letter of recommendation from Dan Marino, I got a job, assistant director of merchandising and licensing for the FedEx Orange Bowl at the time, now just the Orange Bowl. And I went down there and had an amazing time. And that was the year that Peyton Manning's Volunteers played Scott Frost's Cornhuskers in the Orange Bowl, and met a lot of famous people in my time in Miami, as Miami is filled with famous people. I wasn't selling anything. I was doing merchandising and licensing, and I got to learn a lot about that side of the business. When you work at the Orange Bowl, because it's not really a big staff and you do things year round, everyone kind of knows everyone else's job. So when there's an event, all the lower people like me, we're working for the operations staff. So I had a roommate, Scott Carr, who was kind of my level, but he was in operations. So come event time, he was my boss and told me what to do. And I showed up to an event and he said, okay, refill those glasses or do this or do that, or make sure this stays stacked and things like that. So it's a real team effort that we had at the Orange Bowl. I loved it because you got to learn a lot, and it was a neat place to be, and just a lot of great times. As the people you got to meet and just run into that were also a lot of fun.
Back in the 80s, there was a show called Miami Vice. It was a police drama of sorts. It was one of the most popular shows in the nation at that time. Do you have any Miami Vice stories?
I do. Of course, when you're Danny Marino and you're the number one quarterback in the NFL, you're a local favorite in the Miami area. And the second year, I think Danny had his golf tournament there. He brought a guy by the name of Michael Talbot. He was the heavy-set guy, Switek, from the Bug Van. Remember, they had the van literally with cockroach on top.
Yeah.
And Switek was the heavy-set police officer who did the surveillance. And he was an ex-stand-up comic, and he would come do the post-golf outing luncheon. And he was kind of there for comic relief, and he was absolutely hilarious. And like I said, I would hang out with those guys days in advance of the golf outing on Monday. They would come in like Thursday or Friday, and I'd start running around with them, and even went to some establishments where adults imbibed alcohol and went out to bars to eat with them. I was 17 at the time. Once at the prompting of Michael Talbot, he gave me his Miami Vice prop badge, and I carded these two girls because it was a real badge. It just said City of Miami and then Vice on it. And I flashed the badge and carded these two girls at the Permane Brothers, which is a famous sandwich shop in Pittsburgh with the French fries on it. I carded these two girls and busted them for being underage in the bar.
That is hilarious.
And Michael Talbot was a funny guy, and he was a popular anywhere we went because Miami Vice was so popular. Police officers would flock to him because, they loved this show, and he was just so much fun to be around. Like I said, I'm pretty sure he's an ex-stand-up comic because he was just hilarious.
Well, that is dope. And then you went to Seton Hall?
I did. After the Orange Bowl, I went out to Las Vegas and did a 6-month gig with what was then the WAC, the Western Athletic Conference. I went out there and helped put on their basketball tournament in Las Vegas. And I interviewed for some jobs, and one was in El Paso, and another one was to stay in Vegas. And the offer from Vegas, which they said was coming, kept getting put off and off. So I needed a backup, and I went and got a job working for Host Communications, doing the marketing for Seton Hall, and became the general manager of Seton Hall Sports Marketing. What happened was the Western Athletic Conference dissolved, and it became the Great Mountain Conference, or the Mountain West Conference, or whatever it was at that time. And they took all the best teams. So I may have had a job about a year later, but I couldn't wait around, so I got a job at Seton Hall. The good thing about that job was I only had to market basketball. That's how schools got around Title IX. They'd hire an outside vendor to do the marketing for their revenue sports. And now that's the norm everywhere. It was an interesting time. After Seton Hall was when I went back to Florida and ended up in Dallas.
All right. So now we're back to Dallas. Sorry about all that time travel, folks. So you're in Dallas and you're working for the Cowboys organization and Cowboy Radio or whatever. I believe you were doing some yard work. And then what happened?
Well, I'd left the Cowboys Radio Network and I was working for The Ticket, KTCK.
Oh, okay.
Sports Talk Radio. But I was working for them and I was helping a friend on the weekend. His father was restoring a home and I scratched the side of my head real bad. Something stupid. It didn't heal.
Like where on your head?
Kind of right above my ear, kind of right in the middle of the meat of your head. Kind of where you'd have a Brian Bosworth line in the side of your head. Dating myself. So, yeah, I scratched my head, and I didn't think it was much. But being a diabetic, I didn't fight off the infection. And I woke up one morning, and my left eye was watering and itching. And by the time I got to the hospital, I could barely see out of it. And they took me to an emergency room. They put me under, and I woke up, and they said, you have a staph infection in your eye. If it spreads to your brain, you'll die. You have a couple days to decide what to do about your eye, but we suggest you remove it. I had blue eyes. I'd already looked at it, and it looked like someone had stirred my eye like a drink. The blue was smeared, and it was not good, and I couldn't see anything out of it.
Wow.
And I told them that I needed a couple minutes, and took a couple minutes and did a little praying, and my dad's advice is, I'm not going to lose any ground. I'm not going to risk dying. So I called the doctors back in after about 5 minutes, and I said, gritting through my teeth, praise God and take my eye. So the next morning they took out my left eye, and I started the life of being the one-eyed Joe.
All right, guys, I think I'm going to cut it right there. Thank you for checking out part 1. Make sure you come back next week for part 2. As always, thanks for listening, Streetwalkers. And don't forget, follow the show on Twitter at FascinationSTPD, on Instagram at Fascination Street Pod. Follow the podcast page on Facebook at Fascination Street Podcast. And of course, you can always email me at fascinationstreetpod@gmail.com. And if you haven't already, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button and rate us on iTunes. Opening music is the song Magnolia from the 2014 album Intransigence, used with permission from Douglas Miles Clark. Closing music is Apollo from the 2001 album Into the Known by the band Sapphire. Thanks for hanging out with us and getting to know a little bit about our guest. We'll see you next time on Fascination Street.